So in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the writing. It's kind of interesting because I have a background in literature. I'm doing my PhD in literature, focusing on Paradise Lost. I've read a lot of classics. I've read a lot about craft, about writing fiction, because I've wanted to write fiction for a long time. I've always had trouble finishing any fiction. Um, so this year, 2015 was really the time when I kind of stopped working and focused on my writing full time. And I had to learn a lot because until you've spent the time, you don't really understand writing until you've done a lot of it. And they say it takes about 1 million words to kind of know what you're doing. So that's almost 10 full-length novels. So until you've written 10 full-length novels or 1 million words, I would say novels because you can write 1 million words of crap without thinking about the story. But if you've tried to write novels, then you're thinking about the plot points and the resolution and everything you need that goes into a best-selling story. Um, so it takes a lot of effort and it takes a lot of time. It's difficult. A lot of authors think about the book they want to write and they think about a few key scenes and a few ideas, but they're not really doing the work. They're not really doing the writing. They might write a couple hundred words a day, but most of the time, like months go by and they don't do anything. And so I want to address, people call it writing block. I think that's misleading to say that you have writer's block. There's probably another issue, and I think the issue is probably that you haven't plotted your book. You don't know what happens next. If you don't know what happens in your story, if you don't have your scenes mapped out, of course you're going to get stuck. You get stuck because you know there's a problem with the book. You know that something isn't working, that it's not satisfying, that it's no good. You're questioning yourself. That happens if you don't plot out your story, or if you're writing something but you just don't know where it goes. So you'll save so much time and effort. The books I mentioned in the last video were Plot Perfect, Story Fix, and Story Grid, which I highly recommend. They all come with different templates, but basically, I think Larry Brooks, who has Story Grid, his basic format is something like 15 chapters to the first plot point. The first plot point is like you've set up the scene and the intrigue and the characters. All the characters have been introduced, but then there's a point of no return where the hero is called onto an adventure. They cross a threshold. Nothing can go back to what it was before, and they're kind of forced onto the core story. That happens at the first plot point. That's about 25% of the way into your book. So you need to know what that scene is. That's a really important scene. Then there's another 15,000 words to the midpoint. The midpoint is kind of where the crisis has been building. In every scene, there's conflict. In every scene, the main character wants something, but they can't get it, or they get it and then they need something else. You get to the midpoint, and suddenly the character, so far she's always been on defense. She's always been refusing the call. At the midpoint, everything changes. She kind of looks. There's another really good book called Right from the Middle. I don't remember the author's name, but it's very good. It talks about the midpoint and how crucial it is. But at the midpoint, basically the character looks in a mirror and has to figure out who she is, what she wants, how things change, and they go from being a passive receiver where the antagonist is mostly doing all of the work, and they go into being a soldier where something's changed in them and they're going to fight back. They're going to take more action. They go from being passive to more an active player. Then they mess everything up for another 15 chapters. Everything they do fails. They fail. They try again. They fail until the second plot point, which is just before, they call it the Dark Night of the Soul, which is a huge failure. Like everything they wanted, their main goal for the whole novel was to do this thing, and they find out they either didn't complete it or they did complete it and they found out that everything was a lie. They were being misled by the antagonist. They might have this crucial scene that's the hero at the mercy of the villain, where the villain is kind of talking about their plan. The heroes completely failed. They're dejected and depressed. That's the second plot point. It comes about 2/3 or 3/4 of the way into the book. And then there's the talk with what's it called? Their helper or their friend who gives them a little pep talk or a rally, or they figure out what they're fighting for. They basically get their, like they've given up completely, but they have to be talked back into completing the mission or trying again. So then they try again, even though there's no hope for success, and somehow they succeed and they defeat the antagonist and they finish the story. Or at least they survive, or at least there's a final battle and they escape and they survive. That's kind of how most fiction goes. If you're writing literary fiction, of course, it's not going to go like that, but you still need to consider your first, second, and third acts. You need to learn a little bit about, what's it called? When you're writing a movie, screenplay, because it's simpler and they really focus on the structure. In writing a novel, authors don't always focus on the structure, and that's kind of a big mistake. If you're a pantser, if you're a dedicated pantser and you refuse to plot and that's working for you and you've published successful fiction that's selling well, that's fine. You don't need to listen to anything I'm saying. But if you're having difficulty finishing your novel, it's probably because you haven't plotted it out and you haven't thought about these key structures that have to be in place, because it does make it a lot easier. If you plot out your story well, if you plot it out, and even, of course, it's going to change, but if you have a map, at least you're going to be able to get through the first rough draft. And that's really the problem where most authors never can get into the story. The first rough draft is going to be crap. And that's the other difficulty most authors face, is when you start out writing a novel, your first draft is going to be bad and it's painful and you hate it and you hate yourself because you think, I thought I could be an author and I'm writing this garbage. I'll never be successful. I'll never finish. It's a crisis, a creative crisis that a lot of authors face and never come back from. But you need to get past it. The first draft is going to be ugly. That's fine. It's supposed to be that way. It has to be that way. You're really just figuring out the story. Because when you get through the first rough draft, you have your map, but you fill in your scenes and you get to know your characters, and things are going to change. And you're going to discover more and more stuff about what has to happen to get to the places that you want to be. So every time you go through it, it might take you 5 or 6 passes from beginning to end. And you can kind of skip around. If you're having trouble with a scene, skip to another scene that you like better. But it's going to take you a lot of time and effort to get through the first rough draft, which is probably going to be about 70,000 words. For a fantasy, it could be more like 120,000. But if it's your first novel, especially if you're trying to get it traditionally published, shoot for 70 to 80,000 words, because they're not really going to be interested in a longer novel from a first-time author, because they know it's more difficult to sell to publishers. So you want to be in that range. And you do it just by know what happens in the scene, have a very brief notes, that the character wants this, they're here. Don't focus on the writing, don't focus on the scene or the description so much. Focus on the dialogue and what happens. But basically with the rough draft, you're just plotting it out. You're just getting some words on the paper. I would use something like, I like a program called Write or Die, which you set a limit. You set I'm going to write 3,000 words in an hour or in 2 hours, and you just have to do it. Or you sit down, you set a timer. You say, I'm going to get up and I'm going to write for 30 minutes a day. I'm going to work on this scene. Most people have trouble writing because it's not part of their habit. It's difficult. It's a new skill that takes a lot of time and dedication. You need to set aside a half hour or an hour a day, and you need to sit down and do the work. Even if you just sit down and close everything else off and don't do, even if you're not writing, even if you just set that time aside so that you could be writing and you get in the habit of opening up your Word document and trying, that'll start paying off for you, and it gets easier and easier if you stick with a schedule. You can get a calendar and make a big X mark of every day that you sat down and you opened up your document and you at least tried, because then you'll be able to see visually how many days in a row you've sat down and done the work. Things like that are really important, just to kind of get you in the flow and to keep it consistent. It takes, to write a rough draft of 70 or 80,000 words, takes a couple months of consistent effort. And that's where most people will just never get there. It's not about having skill or being a good writer. It's just about sitting down and doing the work. Once you've gotten to your first rough draft, then you can start people say take some time off, which is fine. I would definitely reward yourself and take a week or two off, but then go back. And when you start going through it again, you're not really even editing it yet. You're not revising it. That's when you start fixing your dialogue, fixing your description, adding in more like how does the scene look, and making the writing better to some extent. But don't make like every sentence beautiful, because you're probably going to cut a lot of that later. In the first draft, you're going to cut a lot of stuff. So you need to start going through and identifying which scenes don't work at all, what doesn't need to be there, what's distracting. You're going to be wanting to cut some stuff out. So then you finally go through, you do all that polishing and cleaning, and then you might have a first clean draft, like a second rough draft that's almost readable. Like you could almost give it to somebody and have them read it. I would still wait and do another total pass through like a couple weeks later, because every time you go through it, you're going to find out so much more. I would read a couple of those books like Story Fix and Story Grid again, and then download their exercises and their templates and map it out with your clean rough draft and see where the problems are, because you need to fix those problems. Even if you hire an editor, they're not going to be able to fix everything for you. They'll be able to do so much more for you if you do the work first. So don't be quick to pass it on, because that's what feels easy, is to say, well, I'm done, I've done my best, now I'm going to give it to somebody else. But that's really a mistake, because nobody's going to do as much work on your book as you're going to do, and you're learning about writing in the process. So if you're giving up those later self-editing stages, you're missing out on crucial education, because the first book is going to be really hard, but the fifth or sixth book is going to be so much easier once you've gotten the hang of all of this process. So definitely don't give up, and don't worry about, that your writing sucks, because it's going to suck in the beginning, which is difficult to face, but you have to keep going through it anyway. You have to keep revising and going through it over and over again. Editing is boring and soul-crushing. It's not nearly as much fun as writing, which is why a lot of authors just keep starting new projects and have drawers full of manuscripts, because they don't want to get into the editing. But that's also because if you haven't mapped out your book well, and you've just written 100,000 words of random scenes, it's going to be nearly impossible to edit that into an actual story. And that's why you may be learning to be a better writer, but you're not really learning how to finish a book that you can sell. And so mapping it out and studying story architecture and plotting is really crucial to being a better and faster writer. Because otherwise you're just going to, it's very easy to just write for 10 years and never publish anything if you're not taking seriously how to write a story that readers are going to be satisfied with. And that's usually plotting. It's usually plotting and storytelling. It's almost never the writing. People like the writing, but it's the storytelling that's crucial, that your book is going to pass or fail. You can have pretty bad amateur writing, but a decent, well-plotted story, and be very successful. So it's not really the writing you need to worry about. It's the story first. You can improve the writing, but that takes time and effort and practice. So I talked about a lot of things. There are other things. I mean, of course, you're going to deal, especially with the first book, with what they call writer's draft or being stuck. But focus on the plotting, focus on studying the craft, and it's going to take a lot of work. And you're going to have to sit down consistently and work on it for a long time. Nobody starts off being a brilliant writer or being able to write novels flawlessly. But the people who finish books are the people who make it a priority. You have to say, I'm going to stop watching TV. I'm going to stop being on Facebook. I'm not going to socialize. I'm not going to go out with my friends. This is my writing time. It's got to come first. If you want to finish a book and publish a book, it's got to be a priority. And you kind of have to be an asshole and turn everything else off and say, I'm just going to, I can't deal with anything else. I have to finish my book. And that's fine, because it's great. If you can finish a book, it's a great achievement. However, like I said, I think in the last video, as long as you're spending all this time writing a book, you want to make sure you're writing a book that's going to satisfy readers and earn some money. Because if not, it's not really, you may feel like it's a great achievement, and it is, but once you finish the book and you publish the book and you start spending more money on book marketing or building an author platform and nobody's buying the book, that's not really something to glorify. I know a lot of authors who have 10 books out on Amazon and they're only making a couple $100 a month. And that's still great because most authors don't make any money. But for the amount of time and effort and money that you've spent into publishing, if you only have an expensive hobby that's taking up all your time and your money and you're not earning the money back, that's not really something that you should feel proud of. You need to learn how to write books that satisfy readers and get better at writing and get better at publishing and marketing so that at least it's fine. Your first book probably won't make any money. That's fine. Your second or third book might not. But once you have 10 books, if you're still not making any money, you're doing a lot of things wrong, crucial things wrong. And you need to figure out what they are. You can't just keep writing more books because there's something in your process. It's either your writing or it's your design or it's your marketing. There's something that's not working that you need to solve before you write more books. And of course, like for me, I would much rather you solve those problems before you write your first book so that your first book, your second book are going to start making money and at least building up your author platform, because everything should be getting easier and easier as you build your platform and as you publish. If that's not happening for you, you're making some mistakes and you need to learn what you're doing wrong. And that's part of why I'm putting out this free video series. I put out a lot of free content, videos, templates, things to help authors because it is a lot of effort and it's a lot of work. I want you to do it right and I want you to be reimbursed for your time and effort. I want you to make money with your publishing. And that's a choice. That's a consideration. It's not something that happens by accident. It's something that authors who deliberate, authors who choose to write books that are going to make money will be much more successful with their books than authors who just write books and hope for the best. Not necessarily, but it doesn't help. And it doesn't help to just stick your head in the sand and hope for the best. It doesn't take long to go through my video series and to learn about publishing and learn about marketing. You can still publish whatever you want, but if nobody's buying it, or worse, if people are buying it and then they don't like it, that's a problem you need to fix. And I hope I can help you to fix those kind of problems. Thanks. Bye-bye.